Hi, everyone, and welcome to session 3 of our writing or K-3 writing teacher professional development series here at the Louisiana Department of Education. Today's session is going to focus on writing and language comprehension. So in our last session, we focused on the importance of building students' capacity to encode with automaticity. And today we're going to focus on that other side of the other side, right? Building their ability to understand language and communicate effectively, right? And writing is ultimately a form of communication. So today we're going to talk through that. My name is Sarah Stolman. I am the K-3 leader, K-3 teacher PD specialist at the Louisiana Department of Education. And here today with me is Ms. Katasha Edwards, and I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I am Katasha Edwards. I am the leader PD specialist here in the literacy division at the department, and we're excited to be back here for session 3 of our writing series. Our presenter information, you can contact us at any time. I am Katasha Edwards, and you can email me at katasha.edwards@la.gov. And if you would like to reach out to Sarah, you can reach out to her at sarah.stolman@la.gov. And we are ready to get started. We'll let Sarah jump into our series for today.
Yeah, we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. If as you listen to the series, you have more questions or you want to talk through some things, we are here. That is what we are here to do. And you can feel free to reach out to either one of us or both of us, and we will get right back to you. Now, today's objective is that by the end of our session, our participants will understand how the language comprehension strands of Scarborough's reading rope inform high quality writing instruction in grades 3. So as we mentioned before, in our last session, we focused on how the word recognition strands inform high quality writing instruction. Today, we're going to talk about an equally important part, those language comprehension strands. So, this is not as important, this is equally important, and both of these play an important role in developing students as writers in these earliest grade levels. Now, just to kind of review, and we talked about this a lot in our last session, but writing is truly a complex process. We've said it in every session, but if teaching reading is rocket science, then teaching writing is whatever is more complex than that. And it really requires our students to manage so many different factors at the same time. They're thinking about their word choice, their spelling, their syntax, right? Making sure sentences make sense. That background information, they're making all of these connections between what they know and their content knowledge. And for students who are not able to encode with automaticity, it's 10 or a million times harder than it is for students who are able to encode, or individuals who are able to encode without putting much thought into that side of it. Writing alone is very hard for even you and I. But imagine if you add that layer of not being able to spell quickly and efficiently. It is truly, truly complex. Now, for those students who are not yet at a point of encoding with sufficient automaticity, even if that encoding is inventive, if they can, spell inventively, but they do it very, very quickly, writing is going to be easier for them. Putting things to print is going to be easier for them. But for those students who are not even there yet, or those who have limited oral language skills, and we find that a lot with our earliest learners, work with writing can and it should begin orally, and really should focus on responding to text. So either by sharing ideas or responding to questions, right? So you might think, oh, I'm doing all this work asking my students questions about the texts that I read and pushing them to think deeply about and make connections between the texts that I've read. That's writing instruction. That work is supporting their ability to become meaningful writers who are able to think critically about texts and then communicate their ideas in written form. So this is an essential building block to writing and not something that you should rush. In the last session, we talked a lot about not rushing that process, right? If students are not encoding with automaticity, we don't rush them to start writing essays, right? There's no benefit to having somebody who can't even form a letter writing an opinion piece on their own, right? For that student, we're really working to build their knowledge of phonics and their ability to write the sounds that they hear. But at the same time, we're also building their capacity to respond to questions about texts. Now, Katasha and I were both kindergarten teachers, and we both know you will have students who can respond beautifully when you ask them a question orally, but when they get to the paper, they might be at the point where they're still writing squiggly lines or circles or, shapes that you don't even recognize. And that's okay, but that's where we're starting our work. We're acknowledging where they're at, and that's where we're starting our work. But building their capacity to respond orally to questions about text and to think critically about text is supporting their ability to write. So really thinking about that as part of your writing instruction is so important. So that work that you're doing in your read aloud, when you're asking them questions and you're pushing them to think about what you're reading and make connections to other things that you read, that's writing instruction too, right? That's supporting their ability to communicate their ideas, even if they're not really ready to put those down in print. Through your systematic explicit phonics instruction, you are working to build their ability to encode with automaticity, but you cannot negate this important work of building their ability to think deeply about text and communicate ideas about text. And for those of you who are maybe third grade teachers or older, when we think about the assessments that we give, right? These assessments require our students to think deeply about text and respond deeply to text. So this work, answering questions and responding in a relevant way and in a critical way to these questions, as the strands of the reading rope braid, our students are going to be better prepared to answer those questions on those tests than if we had spent that time having them sit at their desk and write about what their favorite animal is, right? So we have to think about, kind of reframe our brain to think about this important work that we're doing in reading as being the building block of our writing, as being a building block of our writing instruction. Now, as we have been really mentioning throughout this series, in grades K-3, the focus of writing instruction, like reading instruction, really is on these two key areas, right? Building students' capacity to encode with automaticity, which is what we talked about in our last session. Very important work and work that we must be doing, right? But then at the same time, we're building their capacity to develop these complex thoughts that they will be able to communicate in written form once their encoding skills catch up, right? So if we think about the reading rope, how, we're in one way building their ability to identify words, those word recognition strands, we're also building those language comprehension strands. The same applies for writing, right? Writing is a form of communication. And so as we push students to communicate their thoughts, we are pushing them to be writers. As these strands braid together in the later grades, really towards, as we start to kind of move through first grade and then into second and third grade, we're going to be able to push students to communicate their thinking and writing in much deeper ways, but we don't need to rush that process, right? We follow this trusted process that often many of our curriculum kind of lay out for us, and we move them through that. We don't add extra time to teach them writing. Writing is best taught in the context of the reading instruction that we're doing, right? So keep that in mind. Now, just to revisit Scarborough's reading rope, in our last session, we talked about word recognition and we talked about that work building students' ability to encode. Today, we're really going to focus more on these red threads, right? This language comprehension piece. building their background knowledge, their vocabulary. They have to know what words mean if they're going to include those words in their writing. Their language structure, that is so important. Their understanding of syntax, right? How to develop a sentence that makes sense. You know, if you're familiar with the writing revolution, you know, they say the crux of writing instruction, or the, you know, writing instruction is grounded in a student's ability to craft a meaningful sentence. So they do so much work building students' ability to write sentences that make sense, and that communicate appropriate thoughts using appropriate conjunctions and things of that nature. Their verbal reasoning, right? We want them to be able to communicate and make sense, right? And their literacy knowledge, their print concepts, their genres. We'll talk today about audience and purpose. So we want them to understand these things as they are writing as well. And as they become proficient in both of these areas, they braid together, and they will ultimately become both skilled readers, but also skilled writers. Now, building students' language comprehension is an important step in supporting their writing development, particularly at the earliest ages. Now, this is not separate from the work that you're doing in reading. And I think we need to kind of re-emphasize and emphasize and emphasize and emphasize this again and again and again. But this work is embedded in your curriculum. It's not separate from it. Whatever curriculum you are using to develop your students' knowledge, their background knowledge, this is the foundation upon which you will build your students' ability to respond and write, right? So as we do read aloud, we're strategically asking questions, you know, and as a teacher, yes, you are getting them to think deeply about text, but you're getting them to communicate their thoughts as well. So it's incumbent upon you as the teacher to really push them to communicate their thoughts in a way that's going to support their writing. So if you're asking a question, a simple yes or no answer is not going to suffice. You want your students to start communicating in clear sentences, right? You know, for students who might struggle with oral language, sentence frames are okay. You can use that. But we're building at these earliest levels their ability to communicate their thoughts in these complete sentences. So if you're reading about habitats in a read aloud, and you have some carefully crafted questions that you're going to ask, you're also going to set the expectation for your students about how they're going to communicate their responses to those questions. Because the more they get in the habit of communicating in a meaningful sentence, the easier it is going to be when you start expecting them to respond to read prompts or questions about their reading in written form, right? The transition is going to be very easy compared to if you just let them say, yeah. Do you like habitats? Yeah. No. What kind of habitat does a panda live in? And then push them to really communicate and develop that thought, right? And that's important that you're going to do. Now, in our last session, at the end of this session, Ms. Edwards mentioned that, you know, this is not just something that you can do in your reading curriculum, right? You can also embed writing instruction in your social studies curriculum, in your science curriculum, even in your math. You know, if you think about how when you're responding to a word problem, you know, you want your students to communicate that in a meaningful sentence that makes sense based on the word problem, right? When I was a teacher, I would often tell my students that word problems are often reading comprehension problems, right? So you're thinking deeply about what math they're asking you to do. And then you're communicating your response in a meaningful way. So in that way, math instruction is also writing instruction. Social studies, science, these can also be opportunities to develop your students as writers. But you have to set those expectations and those norms for how they communicate. If you ask a question in social studies, you should expect them to communicate in a clear, meaningful sentence that draws from the text. Same with science, same with math, right? So think about your whole day as an opportunity to teach writing. And then I think you'll feel liberated from the need for an additional writing block, because you're going to see writing instruction is embedded in everything that you do, right? Writing is everywhere. Writing is communication, and it's something that you can do in any context. It is embedded in the work that you're already doing. Now, at the K-3 level, it is so important to help students clearly communicate and articulate their ideas. And those ideas are going to become the foundation for what they communicate in written form. Now, in our previous session, we talked about how at these earliest levels, we might, in the context of our systematic explicit phonics instruction, we might have them begin by writing words or phrases or sentences, right? And that builds them up to being able to write meaningful sentences that they can put together to form an essay, right? But in our knowledge building curriculum, right, where we're building that knowledge for our students, this is where we're really building their capacity to communicate complex ideas. And oftentimes what they can communicate orally far outpaces what they can communicate in writing. So you really want to push their ability to communicate, push them to develop meaningful, relevant sentences. If you ask a question and their response is not relevant, or it does not directly ask the question, reset and push them to do that. Push them to think deeply about what you're asking and respond in a deep, meaningful way. Set that expectation from the beginning. And by, a couple weeks into your class, your students are going to know that you're not accepting a two-word response when you ask a question. You want them to, restate that question, include some evidence, and communicate that orally. And again, just think about how that is going to develop their ability to write as those strands braid together. Now, understanding how to respond to these questions orally is that important first step in their writing journey. And this work can begin in toddlerhood. So if you're a pre-K teacher or a birth to 5 teacher, asking questions, but really pushing your students to respond appropriately to those questions, that's writing instruction, So you have to think about that as an important building block to writing. You guide your students to respond to questions with relevant responses, and that was often something that I noticed as a kindergarten and a first grade teacher, is that you would ask a question and the students just want to share what they love about what you just read, right? So they're raising their hand, you've asked a question, they're raising their hand, and then they're just telling you what they wanted to tell you anyway, right? And then as a coach and as an instructional and as a school administrator, when I was in the classes, I would often find that teachers would kind of affirm that, right? Oh yeah, you did like this story about habitats and you loved learning about the desert habitat. But the question was about, a frozen tundra or something like that, right? So you have to push your students to respond appropriately. If that means giving 2 minutes at the beginning to share what they love about it, to kind of get that out of their system, that's okay, right? But when you're asking those questions, you want to push them to respond appropriately. And think about how you're going to respond when they don't respond in a relevant way, right? When they give you that, what I wanted to share kind of response. You have to kind of guide them back to what you wanted them, because as you do that, you're building their capacity to respond in written form to prompts that they read or that they will be exposed to in the later grades. Now, one thing that you can do is, you can model writing for students based on their responses to questions. So if I ask a question about habitats to my students, or if I ask them, maybe I would want them to respond, with their opinion. Which habitat would you want to live in and why? Well, then I can model how I would write my response to that, to kind of give them a visual of what that might look like. But if they're not ready to do that independently, that's okay too. I might model it to kind of front load them and to show them what this might look like. But the most important thing I want to do is build their capacity to respond appropriately and to think deeply about the texts that we're reading, right? So the work that you do developing good, solid questioning or questions, and then the work that you do in front of your class, pushing them to respond appropriately in relevant and meaningful ways, that is writing instruction. You are supporting their ability to write in that way. Now, as students' ability to encode words with automaticity grows, so throughout first and second and third grade, it's important to give them opportunities to generate their own sentences. And students must understand the components of a strong sentence, right? So, if they can't compose a meaningful sentence, a complete sentence, they're not going to be good writers. So building their understanding of sentences and supporting their ability to craft increasingly complex sentences is also going to prepare them to communicate complex ideas through writing. Is this the work I'm doing in the first 2 months of kindergarten? No, right? I'm really working to build their ability to encode with automaticity. The beginning of first grade, I might be working there to build their ability to encode with automaticity. But as they become more automatic, that's when I start building their ability to compose a meaningful sentence. This sentence level work can be done by having students respond to prompts about what they read, a little exit ticket at the end of a lesson. Like I said, tell me which habitat you would like to live in and why. That is an opinion writing, right? I would like to live in the desert habitat because I love the heat and I love, the flora and fauna that are there in the desert. And this sentence level work is also best done in the context of the content that you're teaching, not separate from that learning. So again, we're not doing separate writing time where we're teaching writing completely independent from what we were doing in reading. This work goes hand in hand as embedded in our reading instruction. I can't emphasize that enough. You're not going to need that separate writing block if you're embedding this writing work in your reading instruction. It's right there. And this sentence level work is really best done in that context of the content that you're teaching. If I give that exit ticket and I ask them, and I notice that they're not applying the sound spellings that they know, or they're not responding in a relevant way, I'm taking that little sheet of paper where they wrote that sentence, and that's what I'm going to do in my small group the next day. Hey, I asked you guys to share what your favorite habitat was, and you wrote an entire few sentences about an iguana, right? It's not relevant, right? That's not good writing. We want them to make sure that they're able to respond appropriately. And it's not complex. It's all embedded there in the context of our curriculum. Now, there are so many great resources available to support students' ability to write high quality sentences. Many of them are free on the Writing Revolution website. I would definitely encourage you to access that. There are many customizable templates that you can use to help your students organize. But once we're at that point where they're encoding with sufficient automaticity, we've moved to developing that, you are going to want to focus on skills like punctuation. This includes capitalization, commas, and punctuation, distinguishing between sentences and sentence fragments, right? Sometimes students don't even know what makes for a complete sentence. You can do little sentence and sentence fragment sorting activities, different types of sentences. So are you asking a question? Is it a sentence where you're writing very excitedly, an exclamatory sentence, or is it a declarative sentence or an interrogative sentence? You're going to want to talk about these different types of sentences, not so much because you want them to remember those types and there's any inherent value in memorizing these different types, but you want to know that there's an appropriate time to use these different types of sentences and then these conjunctions. And if you are familiar with the Writing Revolution, they often start with because, but, and so, and they do a wonderful job of explaining when you would use a because sentence, when you would use a but sentence, and when you would use a so sentence. And really developing your students' ability to do that in these, later first grade, second grade, third grade is really going to support their ability to be good writing. You can support this work by having students unscramble sentence, complete unfinished sentences, and providing feedback on sentences that they complete. And again, this work is embedded in the work of your curriculum. If I'm doing a lesson on the desert habitat, I might have them unscramble a sentence based on that desert habitat, right? And think about that. I have them unscramble a sentence and put it together. That's supporting their reading, supporting their writing, and supporting their ability to craft meaningful sentences. It's one activity, but it's hitting so many different things. So keep it embedded in your curriculum. You can also do it in math, science, social studies. The work of writing is embedded in each of these. Writing spans the day. Every subject that you teach is an opportunity to teach writing. Now, building knowledge is among K-3 students is also an important part of high quality writing instruction. So all of those read alouds that you're doing where you're building their knowledge and building their understanding of their world, the more knowledge that they have once they write, the better the writer they're going to be, right? They're going to be able to make connections between texts. They're going to have more in their brains that they can communicate. So that is important writing work as well. As students' knowledge grows, what they can communicate in writing improves significantly. So think about that. That work building knowledge will pay dividends over the long term. You might think they're going to forget about the 5 senses that you taught them in kindergarten. They're not. As they move into their learning about the human body in 2nd and 3rd grade, they're going to reference that learning in their writing, and they're going to be much more sophisticated writers because of all of that knowledge that you've built in them systematically over time. Now, another aspect of writing at these earliest ages that you're going to want to develop with your students is their awareness of purpose and audience, right? We're moving away from this idea of just generating essays for the sake of writing essays. And we're understanding writing as a purposeful form of communication for a particular audience, right? If I ask you to share what your favorite habitat is, the purpose of that is really for you just to share your opinion. That's your opinion writing. So that's okay. It's okay for you to just tell me what you think. But if I ask for you to share all that you know about the desert habitat, that's not an opportunity, or that's not an appropriate time for you to tell me what you think about the desert habitat, right? That's a time for you to share what you know. Or if I ask you to explain how animals survive in a desert habitat, that's not an opportunity for you to tell me what your personal opinion is on how animals survive. And you have to hold your students accountable for that in your questioning, but also in any sort of small writing that they do in those exit passes, in curriculum embedded writing opportunities, right? And push them to think about that. When is it appropriate for you to communicate your thoughts? When is it appropriate for you to explain something? When is it appropriate for you to share information about it? And then who are you writing for? If you're writing to share it with your class, right? The words that you use might be slightly different than if you're writing to share it with your grandmother, right? Or with the principal, right? So these earliest levels, you want them to be thinking about those things, purpose and audience, because that's going to help them hone in on when it's appropriate to use particular strategies or include particular things in different types of writing. Writing is communication. So all of the work that you're doing to build their ability to communicate meaningfully and effectively is going to translate into high quality writing. But you have to be strategic and push them to respond appropriately to your questions, right? And challenge them, develop them in that way, because that is going to make them better writers. So that that time that you spend asking questions is not wasted time. That is, I mean, every moment of the day is so valuable, but that is so valuable and gives you so much insight into their thinking and how they're comprehending what they hear and then how they're communicating about it. And that is so essential. Now, just like with the reading room, as students' ability to encode words with automaticity increases and their ability to craft meaningful, relevant sentences grows, they're going to be able to develop high quality essays in response to text, right? And this is the work, again, that needs to be embedded in the curriculum, not separate from it. You don't need a separate writing block, right? You might need maybe a few extra minutes in your reading block to support them with writing, right? Embedded in that. But it's not like, okay, close your reading books, put them away, and now open up your writing journals, and we're going to take it in a totally different direction today. The work of writing is embedded in all of the work that you're doing throughout the day. It's not separate from it. They need opportunities to practice writing in that context, in the context of the work that you're already doing. So really reflect on your lessons and really analyze them and look, where is writing embedded, right? At our youngest stages, it might just be through that questioning, right? And our knowledge building side. And then we'll slowly integrate opportunities for them to communicate at a basic level in writing. But they don't have to just go sit for 30 minutes and write in a journal in a meaningless, unconnected way, right? You are embedding your work with writing right here in your curriculum, and reflect on how your curriculum supports that. I am going to turn it over now to Ms. Edwards to talk about how leaders can support this work.
Thanks, Sarah. Today's session had so many powerful nuggets to share with you guys about writing instruction, especially from that language comprehension, those language comprehension strands. And here's just a little bit about how, as leaders, we can support this work. Just to reiterate, when we did the series for K-2 teacher on reading, we had many questions from leaders about, well, what does writing look like aligned to the science of reading? So I think before I even go through this list, just thinking of, we always thought of every teacher as a reading teacher. I think it's equally important for us to think of every teacher as a writing teacher as well, and for us to see every opportunity. So within, there should be a shared writing vision and a shared writing strategies where every teacher sees themselves as a reading teacher and a writing teacher. Even our ancillary teachers have opportunities for students to use those strategies within their classrooms. The next thing is just remember that time to explicitly teach writing should be embedded in the content of the curriculum, whether that's your reading curriculum, your math curriculum, your science curriculum, your social studies curriculum. There should be time for students to do writing across all of those. The next one is professional development. There should be professional development on writing for all teachers. Sarah mentioned that there are many free resources on the writing revolution, but depending on the curriculum that you're using, it may be that you would like to do a cohort of teachers at your school on the writing revolution so that you're building those common sentence level strategies across your campus so that when students have opportunities to write, that you are all speaking the same language. So whether you do the writing revolution PD or you sit down to craft what those writing strategies look like across your campus, I think that's really, really important, which lines up with developing those system-wide strategies for writing instruction. One thing that comes to mind is vertical articulation. I know that oftentimes we sit down with our content teachers and we vertically articulate across grade levels. It's important for us to do that with writing too. I remember as a leader, getting ready for the LEAP 2025, and you pull out that LEAP assessment guidance and you're ready to rock and roll with your third graders, but it's important for you to do some vertical articulation across all those content areas with those assessment guides, because it's important that we don't wait until third grade for students to begin to express themselves in those ways. So they may not be writing it on paper in kindergarten and doing a research simulation task, but there are many opportunities for them to do research simulation orally, even beginning as early as kindergarten and pre-K. So it's just really important that you ensure that writing aligned to the language comprehension strands are included at all grade levels. We don't want to wait until second and third grade for students to begin writing at those language comprehension strand levels, just knowing that what they produce may look a little bit different. It's just really important that we cultivate a writing culture that views writing as an avenue to support and improve student reading across all content areas. So I really enjoyed this session today. I think this was my favorite one so far, the writing series that we have done. And I look forward to those subsequent sessions as we really just build our ability to support students in writing as we build their ability to read. And as those strands become braided, as leaders, we're able to have a good understanding of what support looks like in both of those areas.
Okay, so we do want to thank you guys for joining us. We know this is kind of been a hectic time for many people across our state. And so hopefully having this available in the literacy library for you to access at at a time that works for you will be helpful. But never hesitate to send us some questions or some suggestions. We are happy to do that. Feel free to email either one of us or both. We're in constant contact. So we're happy to support you in any way. And we do want to thank you for joining us. And hopefully we will see you for our next session 4 of our writing series next Tuesday. So have a wonderful day, and thanks for joining us.